In 2019, she was awarded the British Academy Medal for her commitment to documenting the role of corporations in distorting scientific findings for political ends. And her new book, with Eric Conway too, entitled The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market, will be published by Bloomsbury Press in February this next year, in 2023, and is the topic of her talk here. So thank you so much, Naomi, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, let me just launch the slides here, and then I can start. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today and to see some familiar names and faces on the screen, and to have the chance to talk to you today about my new book with Eric Conway, The Big Myth. The book is a history of the construction of a myth. The myth is the myth of the magic of the marketplace. But before I launch into that, I'd like to step back and talk a little bit about the history of climate science and political action, which offers the framework that led Eric and I to become interested in this propaganda, the myth of markets. So as many of you know, in 1992, world leaders launched the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And when the American president, George H.W. Bush, signed the Framework Convention, which commits its signatories to preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, President Bush called on world leaders to translate the written document into, quote, concrete action to protect the planet. But that didn't happen. As we all know, we didn't take those concrete steps that President Bush promised. In fact, the situation is so bad that today, many of us no longer speak of climate change. We speak of the climate crisis. Now, in previous work, such as my work on the scientific consensus on climate change, I've shown that the answer to this lack of action was not for lack of scientific information or lack of clear scientific communication. In fact, we know the work that I and other historians have done has shown clearly that by the 1990s, the science linking carbon dioxide pollution to climate change was well established and had been repeatedly communicated to world leaders. In fact, that's why there was a UNFCCC. Many of you know that the idea that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas can be traced back to the mid-19th century in the work of John Tyndall, who first established what it meant for carbon dioxide to be a greenhouse gas. And that was followed by a century of scientific work in which various scientists, including Svante Arrhenius in Sweden, Guy Callender in Britain, and Roger Revelle in the United States, all emphasized that the basic physics of radiative transfer showed that putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere had the potential to drastically change the climate system. In 1958, the American scientist Charles David Keeling began to systematically measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and showed that carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels was in fact increasing. By 1965, the President's Science Advisory Committee, a committee that included Keeling, wrote to the US president, by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more CO2 in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. And of course, as we all know, that prediction has now come true. Partly because of this science, when the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, a landmark piece of legislation dealing with air pollution, it included weather, visibility, and climate as reasons or effects that should be addressed by efforts to control pollution. And in work that I've recently completed with my students here at Harvard, we've shown that in the 1960s, the US Congress heard extensive testimony on how carbon dioxide pollution could detrimentally alter the planet. We've also shown that throughout the 1970s, there was serious discussion of the policy implications of this by various organizations, including the World Meteorological Organization, the US Department of Energy, and the National Academy of Sciences. Indeed, by 1979, the US National Academy of Sciences had concluded that, quote, a plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use. In other words, we see from the historical evidence that already by 1979, there was a consensus that global warming from burning fossil fuels and deforestation would happen. And furthermore, that it was not a small concern. The National Research Council wrote, "The close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which his society has evolved suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society." The big question in the 1970s was not whether or not climate change would happen, but when would it happen? By 1988, this question was beginning to be answered. NASA climate modeler James Hansen and his team concluded that the answer to that question was now, that man-made climate change was underway and could be detected in climate models. Hansen testified to this effect to the US Congress in the summer of 1988, when he declared that he was 99% certain that man-made climate change was underway. And this was reported in many newspapers around the globe, including on the front page of the New York Times. Now, like most scientists, Jim Hansen believed that his work would lead to political action. This is what I have called in my work supply-side science. The assumption that the job of scientists is to supply policy relevant information, and the job of policymakers is to use it. The historian Josh Howe has referred to this as the belief in the forcing function of knowledge. But as we all know, that's not what happened. Instead of concrete political action, the scientific findings triggered a politically motivated campaign to challenge the science and cast doubt upon it. This is the story that Eric Conway and I told in our book, Merchants of Doubt, how a cadre of scientists, mostly physicists, cast doubt on the science for political reasons. And one of the questions we wanted to answer in that book was why. We had overwhelming evidence that these scientists had done these things, but why would they do it? Why would educated and intelligent people deny basic scientific findings? Why would they deny the work of their own colleagues? And what we were able to show based on their own writings, their letters, their publications, was that the answer was not so much money as ideology, the ideology of market fundamentalism. What we discovered was that climate change denial had nothing to do with the science. What it had to do was the problem that climate change was a market failure, that a legal product, oil and gas and coal, bought and sold freely in the marketplace, was threatening the future of life on Earth. And this was, of course, the same as was true for the story about the ozone hole. And this suggested that governments needed to act to remedy those market failures. Market fundamentalists, like the scientists we studied in our book, feared that government action to address those market failures would threaten political freedom. So what is market fundamentalism? This is the question that Eric Conway and I took up after we finished Merchants of Doubt, and is the central subject of our new book. So market fundamentalism is the belief in the power and beneficence of markets, often referred to in the singular as the free market. But it's not just a belief in the power of markets, it's coupled to hostility to government action, tied to the belief that governments are inefficient. So many economists will tell you that markets are efficient, but government is inefficient, but also crucially an additional political claim, the fear that government power is a slippery slope to totalitarianism. So one telling example of this, which we wrote about in Merchants of Doubt, involved tobacco. One of the questions we had is why these scientists made common cause with the tobacco industry to defend a product that the scientific evidence showed was deadly. So one of the key players in our story was this man, a physicist named S. Fred Singer. He was a Cold War rocket scientist, a very prominent physicist, and he had been involved in numerous campaigns to challenge scientific evidence of acid rain, of global warming, and of the ozone hole. In the 1990s, he worked with the US Tobacco Institute. This was a consortium put together by tobacco companies to challenge the evidence of the harms of secondhand smoke. Now, by this time, secondhand smoke had been shown scientifically to kill hundreds of thousands of people every year, including infants and children. So why would anyone defend it? Well, Singer explained in his own words in a report he wrote, he said, if we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there's essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives. The argument went that if you allow the government to compromise freedom, such as the freedom to smoke, then you risk losing all freedom. And therefore, even seemingly good regulations like restrictions on smoking are in fact bad because they threaten our freedom, not just the freedom to smoke, but all freedom. So it's not so much an economic argument as it really is a political argument. Put another way, these people argue that any compromise to the free market economic system will pose a threat to our democratic political system, and this would put us on the road to socialism or worse. So we see that in many of their writings, they imply that this is deliberate. They refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside, but red on the inside. And this explains why a scientific issue like the harms of tobacco or the importance of carbon pollution could be, quote, politicized. But they argued, although there would be some people who they thought were using these things deliberately to bring in socialism through the back door, they also believe that it could be inadvertent. And so their argument is essentially a slippery slope argument, that you may start out doing things for which you have good reason, but pretty soon the government is controlling everything. And in some ways, that's worse, they argue, because well-meaning people end up doing damage. In short, the merchandising of doubt was driven not by epistemic concerns about the science, not by weaknesses or instabilities in the science, but by politics, by political ideology, by political commitments to laissez-faire economics, but tied to the belief in the link between free market capitalism and democracy, personal freedom, and a hostility to government regulation or other action in the marketplace for fear that it threatens personal freedom. In other words, the belief that protecting free market capitalism is essential to protecting freedom. In the 1990s, this would sometimes be reduced to the claim, capitalism is freedom. So that's essentially the story that we told in Merchants of Doubt. But as we began to look more deeply into market fundamentalism and its history, we discovered that it's a much older idea. And in fact, in the 1930s, this same idea had a different name, and it was called by its advocates the indivisibility thesis. One of these advocates was J. Howard Pugh. J. Howard Pugh was an American industrialist, an extremely conservative, politically conservative man. He was the chairman of the board and president of the Sun Oil Corporation, and also active in the trade organization, the National Association of Manufacturers. In the 1940s, he corresponded with Rose Wilder Lane, a famous libertarian journalist and writer. And in the book, we have a lot more about Rose Wilder Lane, but I don't have time to cover that today. So in this one letter from 1948, he really sums up what the indivisibility thesis is. And he says, quote, I believe that freedom is indivisible. When a part is taken away, that which remains is no longer freedom. To illustrate, suppose we should lose our industrial freedom. Then it would require a compulsory form of government to enforce the decrees having to do with the conduct of industry. And a compulsory state can brook no freedoms. So where did the it's not invisibility, it's indivisibility. I need to fix that. Where did the indivisibility thesis come from? Because it clearly didn't come from history. Pugh was not drawing on the facts of history, and in fact, on some level, the indivisibility theory was obviously untrue. If we think about the history of 19th century capitalism, it had unleashed a world of hurt. But a good deal of this hurt had been remedied by political reforms that did not lead to totalitarianism. In fact, those political reforms arguably strengthened democracy and civil society. So, for example, if we think, and in the book, we focus primarily on the United States and the United Kingdom, but we talk a bit also about political and labor reforms in Germany and France. If we think about the 19th century, if we think about slavery, child labor, and what the poet William Blake famously called the dark satanic mills, the brutal working conditions, often with literal starvation wages and no limits on the hours that employees could demand and no limits on the terribleness of the conditions under which workers worked, these were remedied through political reforms. In the United States in the early 20th century, the US experienced something that was referred to at the time as the accident crisis. This has been largely forgotten by most people, except some historians, but in the early 20th century, millions of American workers were killed or seriously injured on the job every year. In anthracite mining, one of the most dangerous trades, 6% of workers were killed every single year. In 1900, 1 in every 1,000 American workers were killed on the job, which would have been the equivalent of about 1.5 million people every year today. And in 1914, it would have been safer for a young man to go fight in World War II than to go work on the railroads or in an American mine. So as I've suggested, unregulated markets had produced a universe of hurt and suffering, particularly on the part of workers. But the free market hadn't even protected competition. When markets were unregulated, competition was often replaced by monopoly. And so governments began to step in to prevent bank panics and to remedy cutthroat competition and monopolistic practices. In the United States in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Bill outlawed monopolistic business practices that were designed to undermine free competition, and it passed the US Congress overwhelmingly by a vote of 51-1 in the Senate and 242-0 in the House. Now, interestingly, if you read the documents surrounding the Sherman Act, it's clear that the Sherman Act was not only intended to protect competition, but it was also intended to protect democracy against corporate concentrations of power. And this was strengthened in 1914 by the Clayton Act. And finally, of course, the Great Depression. The Great Depression showed that free markets did not guarantee prosperity. In fact, reckless financial speculation had played a major role in the crash of 1929. So in both Europe and the United States, governments had stepped in to stop these practices through law and regulation, to protect workers, to deal with dangerous working conditions, to limit or abolish child labor, to eliminate slavery. And this was widely hailed as progress. In fact, by the 1930s, there were various laws that had been passed to protect competition, to correct market failures, to protect the innocent and the vulnerable. And this is just a list of a few of many laws that were passed in the United States and the United Kingdom. We could also include many of the Bismarckian reforms in Germany. The crucial point historically is that these reforms had led neither the United States nor the UK nor France or Germany into totalitarianism. In fact, rather the opposite. Most historians would argue, particularly in Germany, that the Bismarckian reforms strengthened liberal democracy rather than weakening it. So why did anyone believe the indivisibility thesis? Well, like most historical questions, there's a short answer and a long answer. I'm going to start with the short answer, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the long answer. The short answer is that this argument about capitalism and freedom was promulgated by two of the most influential economists of the mid-20th century, Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman. Their influential books that some of you will be familiar with were Hayek's 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, and Milton Friedman's 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom. These are two very different books in tone and style, but the central idea of both is the same. And in fact, in Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman acknowledges that he is inspired by von Hayek's Road to Serfdom. The argument is the indivisibility thesis, that capitalism and freedom, or put another way, political and economic freedom, are indivisible and inextricable. Both Friedman and von Hayek were economists. They're known and famous as economists, but the argument of these books is not primarily economic. It's not an argument in defense of free market capitalism as an efficient means to deliver goods and services. It's a political argument that capitalism and freedom are linked, and if we wish to preserve political freedom, we must preserve economic freedom as well. And if we compromise economic freedom by allowing government to control the marketplace, let's say, for example, by limiting child labor, It's only a matter of time before we lose our other freedoms, even if it's seemingly for a good cause, like eliminating child labor. So this becomes a major argument of conservative thinkers, particularly in the United States, that centralized economies threaten freedom by concentrating power, but market economies protect freedom by distributing power. Now, how is the marketplace a form of distributed power? Well, the argument goes like this. Various individuals making free choices every day hold power in their hands and prevent its concentration in centralized government. Conversely, centrally planned economies entail not just the concentration of economic power, but of political power as well. And that's why the free market is a bulwark against totalitarianism, because it distributes power. And therefore compromises to the market system, even if well-meaning, do political damage by compromising liberty. So in 1944, von Hayek wrote, quote, "The unforeseen but inevitable consequences of socialist planning create a state of affairs in which, if the policy is to be pursued, totalitarian forces will get the upper hand." In his introduction to the 2007 edition of The Road to Serfdom, historian Bruce Caldwell elaborates, Hayek believed that full-scale planning requires that the planning authorities take over all production decisions. To be able to make any decisions at all, they would need to exercise more and more political control. If one tries to create a truly planned economy, one will not be able to separate control of the economy from political control. Now, note here, Caldwell is focusing on the idea of full-scale planning, a fully centralized economy. But in both Hayek's and Friedman's work, this is now extended to be an argument against any kind of government involvement in the marketplace. So Hayek's argument in 1944 is an argument against communism and forms of socialism and social democracy that he thinks can slide into communism. And I think we can acknowledge that in Europe in 1944, this was perhaps not an unreasonable concern. Communism in 1944 appeared to many people to be a live threat. But it's worth noting a few things about this argument. And one of them is that Hayek's argument was not nearly as extreme as many of his later followers would suggest or claim. Hayek, like Adam Smith before him, accepted that some constraints on economic activity were entirely warranted. The reality is that The Road to Serfdom is not a brief against big government, and it's not a brief for laissez-faire. Hayek wrote, "The successful use of competition as the principal social organization precludes certain types of coercive interference with economic life, but it admits of and even requires others." He continued, "It is important not to confuse opposition against planning with a dogmatic laissez-faire attitude. The liberal argument is in favor of making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human efforts, not an argument for leaving things just as they are." Indeed, Hayek specified quite a few legitimate forms of interference in the marketplace, interference being his word. I don't like interference. It makes it seem as if it's unnatural. I think it's better to talk about involvement, but interference is Hayek's word. So, for example, perfectly reasonable government actions include putting signposts on roads, preventing the harmful effects of deforestation, of some methods of farming, or the noise and smoke of factories, prohibiting the use of poisonous substances, or to require special precautions in their use, limiting working hours, enforcing sanitary conditions in workplaces, controlling weights and measures, preventing violent strikes. In short, Hayek was not actually a libertarian. He simply argued that if governments are to carry out some functions, they should do so equitably, and if doing so selectively limits the freedom of groups or individuals, then the justification for this intervention should be clear and compelling. And I should just point out, this argument about clear and compelling, I think, is really crucial because, of course, scientists would argue that the justification for action on climate change is clear and compelling, which is why the merchants of doubt had to fight the science and argue that it wasn't clear and it wasn't compelling. So that's von Hayek, but now let's turn to Milton Friedman. His positions were far more extreme. As Philip Moravsky and Dieter Pluva have noted, Friedman denies almost any legitimate role for government other than organizing the military, maintaining law and order, enforcing contracts, defending property rights, and printing money and providing a monetary framework. In the Capitalism and Freedom, Milton Friedman is absolutely explicit. He has a long list of things that the government should not do, and these include enforcing military conscription, regulating banks, regulating radio and television, running social security or unemployment programs, supporting public education, establishing or maintaining national parks, operating toll roads, building or subsidizing public housing, having a veterans administration, passing minimum wage laws, permitting rent control, and Friedman writes, this list is, quote, far from comprehensive. Indeed, Moravsky and Kluwer conclude that the role of government in Friedman's view is, quote, reduced to a skeleton. Friedman also says that government should rarely, if ever, pass laws against pollution, pass or enforce laws to protect workers, such as workplace safety, enforce antitrust laws or other regulations to control business practices, even if those practices are anti-competitive. Now, why? Why is he so opposed to these things that most people by the mid-20th century had considered obviously necessary? Well, his reason is that government action in the marketplace always compromises freedom, and therefore he argues the cure is almost always worse than the problem it seeks to remedy. So this is the short story. It's a story of two prominent thinkers who built an argument about why the government should not be involved in the marketplace, even if for seemingly good reasons like preventing pollution. But the longer story, the story that we flesh out in the new book, is how these two thinkers became so influential, particularly in the United States, and particularly with an argument that in so many ways was easily refuted by the facts of history. Now, if you're not yourself a conservative or libertarian, you may not know just how influential these books have been. And if you are a conservative, then please stay with me. But in the United States, the road to serfdom is routinely touted by many of America's most prominent conservative voices, people like the television personality Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, the newspaper The National Review, Tucker Carlson on Fox News, the Texas Senator Ted Cruz, the Michigan Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, Paul Ryan, and many, many more. Hayek was invited to the White House by both Presidents Bush and Reagan, and in 1991, he received the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor that the U.S. government bestows on anyone. President George H.W. Bush, who succeeded Ronald Reagan, called The Road to Serfdom a book that, quote, still thrills readers everywhere. Former Harvard president and U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers has explicitly compared Hayek to Adam Smith. Summers suggested that the most important lesson of economics, which he attributed to Smith and Hayek, is that, quote, the invisible hand of the marketplace, quote, is more powerful than the hidden hand of government intervention. What Hayek stressed, Summers said, was that, quote, things will happen in well-organized efforts without direction, without controls, without plans. That's the consensus among economists, and that's the Hayek legacy. In other words, the government doesn't have to intervene, just leave things to the marketplace and it will all work out. So von Hayek's work has been highly influential in American conservative circles, and even in some not so conservative circles. But Capitalism and Freedom was even more influential. It was first published in 1962, but it is still in print. It has sold more than 500,000 copies. It has gone through multiple editions, 18 translations. It's on nearly every list of top 10 conservative books. Many lists of the top 100 books of all time, including Time Magazine and the Times Literary Supplement. Friedman became a weekly columnist for Newsweek magazine, where he wrote hundreds of editorials. He served as an advisor to the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, as well as to the American President Ronald Reagan. In 1976, he won the Economics Nobel Memorial Prize, and in the 1980s, his book was made into a 10-part television series called Free to Choose, the only economics book ever made into a television series in the United States. And he was awarded both the National Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science. I think it's fair to say that Friedman is one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century. But he became influential with an argument which, as I've already suggested, was easily refuted by the facts of history, even at the time he wrote it, plus much, much more that has happened since then. Indeed, when Capitalism and Freedom was first published, most reviewers at the time criticized it as grossly oversimplified, possibly immoral, and because of these flaws, unlikely to be of much influence. Leading outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Time magazine did not even review it. And those who did review it mostly dismissed it. The Chicago Tribune said that the book was easy to poke fun at, and that the questions that were raised were important ones, but, quote, our answers will not be Professor Friedman's. The New Leader called the book incredible, in the literal sense of being not credible, particularly Friedman's claim that markets would solve the problem of racial discrimination. And remember, this is 1962, when there's enormous pressure on the federal government of the United States to do something about legalized segregation and discrimination in the American South. So the New Leader wrote, quote, will Americans' corporate giants soon begin to employ Jewish, Puerto Rican, and Negro executives out of careful calculation of how expensive it is to cut themselves off from the services of talented members of these groups? Friedman would have us believe so. And this was one of Friedman's key arguments, that we didn't need civil rights laws because intelligent employers would, of course, want to use the talents of these people, so discrimination would go away on its own. The Business History Review described the writing as, quote, bitter, dogmatic, and petulant, and said that Friedman's work, the tie between theory and actuality, has practically disappeared. One of the longest and most extensive reviews was written by Leon Kesserling, who had been the head of President Truman's Council of Economic Advisors, who reviewed the book for the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Kesserling wrote that the book, quote, sheds no light on economic problems as such. Its overall formulation was either, quote, inconsequential or misleading. And nearly all of Friedman's claims might be equally valid if turned on their heads. So he wrote, quote, Dr. Friedman says that by relying primarily on voluntary cooperation and private enterprise in both economic and other activities, we can ensure that the private sector is a check on the powers of the government sector and effective protection of freedom of speech, religion, and thought. In the American context, there is at least equal merit to the opposite proposition, that centralized government power is essential to prevent private action or decentralized state or local action from impairing freedom of speech, religion, or thought. Even the avowedly neoliberal magazine, The Economist, published in London, criticized the central premise of leaving everything to individuals making choices in the marketplace. Friedman, the reviewer suggested, was woefully unrealistic in suggesting that, quote, all people who are neither children nor insane are responsible. A little experience of social problems would teach him that the dividing line is blurred and that prisons, asylums, and cash are insufficient to look after the poor and weak. Professor Friedman does not really face this issue. Now, no one thought that the question that Friedman was raising was illegitimate. Indeed, reviewers all agreed that the question of the role and purpose of government was a perennial and important one, and indeed that it had been central to the creation of the United States. But the historical question, which I want to pose here, or that Eric Conway and I pose in our book, how did such a bitter and petulant book, in which the relation between theory and actuality had practically disappeared, how did a book that was that flawed and recognized as that flawed become so hugely influential? And so this is what brings us to our longer answer. And again, I don't have time today to go into all the details, and I hope that when the book comes out, you will be motivated to read it. But the longer answer is a half-century-long propaganda campaign by American business to promote this central idea. And so this is the story that we tell in The Big Myth. Now, like all good myths, this myth, the indivisibility thesis, embeds several submyths. So one submyth is the notion that the market exists unto itself, that there is even a thing that we can call the market, that the market has agency and even wisdom. When of course the reality is that people make markets. Then markets are human institutions. They've been around since biblical times, and people have been setting the rules under which they operate for just as long. So if you read Leviticus, you can find all kinds of rules about how markets should and should not operate. There is indeed no such thing as the free market, and there never has been. Another submyth is that government cannot improve the functioning of markets, it can only interfere. And this is why von Hayek uses the word interference. Governments therefore need to stay out of the way, lest they, quote, distort the market and prevent it from doing its magic. Again, the reality is that governments have always been involved in markets, and in many cases have created markets, improved their functioning, or filled needs that markets left unfulfilled. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith talks at length about the need for governments to do things that the market won't do, like build roads and bridges. And then the submyth as well, or maybe this is the myth, is the indivisibility thesis. This idea that capitalism and freedom are indivisible. So any compromise to economic freedom threatens political freedom. Therefore, the government needs to stand back and let the market do its magic. And as I've already suggested, the reality is that history has on multiple occasions proved this to be untrue. So our book's argument is that the reason why this untrue story took hold is that for more than half a century, American business leaders worked in various ways to promote this myth, to give it credibility. And they consciously worked to persuade Americans to loathe government, to distrust government, and to love the free market. And this culminated in the 1980s with the election of Ronald Reagan, whose central theme of his inaugural address when he became president in 1980 was to claim that government is not a solution to our problem. Government is the problem. So telling this story, the story of a big myth, has required a big book, and these are just a few of the things that we cover in the book, none of which I have time to talk about today, but I hope this will motivate you, to be interested to read the book when it comes out. But what I'd like to focus on in my remaining time is how these people promoted this key argument linking capitalism and freedom, because this argument has been central to American conservative ideology since the 30s and continues to inform it today. And I think continues to inform resistance to action on climate change, among other things. So in the book, we trace this argument back to Herbert Hoover. In fact, a little bit earlier, but Herbert Hoover is the first person who really articulates it very, very clearly, and in a book that was highly influential. So as most people know, Herbert Hoover lost the US presidency to Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, but he remained a highly influential figure in Republican Party, conservative and business circles. And in 1934, he articulated his political philosophy in a book called Challenge to Liberty. And he wrote, quote, "It holds both in principle and in world experience that intellectual and spiritual freedoms cannot thrive except where there are also economic freedoms. It insists equally upon protections to all these freedoms, or there is no liberty." This then was re-articulated by J. Howard Pugh in the letter that I already read to you as the indivisibility thesis, sometimes also referred to as the inseparability thesis. Now, Pugh was a leader in the trade group, the National Association of Manufacturers. In the 1910s and 20s, they had fought child labor laws. Today, this group continues to fight against climate policy and carbon pollution regulation. The indivisibility thesis was heavily promoted by Pugh and NAM in propaganda campaigns in the 1930s and 40s, targeted at teachers, ministers, community leaders, and ordinary American citizens. Now, Pugh and his colleagues, and they did this through a whole variety of means, which again, we describe in the book, films, books, lecture series, magazines targeted at teachers, magazines targeted at young people. So advertising campaigns, television programs in the 1950s, radio programs and films in the 1930s. So a very massive propaganda campaign, which we describe in detail in the book. But they faced three key problems, which they recognized even at the time. First, as I've already suggested, the indivisibility thesis wasn't true. It was an assertion supported by no evidence and in fact refuted by substantive evidence. It was also hypocritical. Nam and Pugh argued for businessmen's freedom to set wages and working hours in their factories, but fought bitterly against the freedom of workers to unionize or to engage in collective bargaining. And it was self-serving, particularly in the 1940s, as memories of the Depression were still vivid and bitter. As historian Wendy Wall had noted, in the wake of the economic collapse of the 1930s, the, quote, narrative of capitalist-driven growth seemed questionable at best, a monstrous delusion at worst. So how would they make this case credible? They're making an argument that is refuted by history, and it's refuted by the experience of most ordinary people. So how could they make this case credible? And what they concluded was that they needed intellectuals to make the case credible. And so they recruited von Hayek to come to America, and they financed a position for him over faculty objections at the University of Chicago. And then they produced two simplified versions of his argument, which they also, again, heavily promoted. And they created a research project, also at the University of Chicago, called the Free Market Project, to further promote Hayek's work and argument. Capitalism and Freedom was the final result, well, not the final result, but was the product of that project. So let me talk a little bit about how these men brought von Hayek to America. In 1944, a group of executives associated with NAM created a new group, which they called the Foundation for Economic Education. It was America's first libertarian think tank, and it was focused very strongly on promoting laissez-faire economics through books, through school curriculum, magazines, newspaper articles, etc. The group included J. Howard Pugh, who we've already met, but also David Goodrich of Goodrich Tires, Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company, Charles Kettering of General Motors, and DuPont executive Jasper Crane, and a Missouri businessman named Harold Luno, who was the head of a libertarian foundation called the Volcker Fund. And if you've read Philip Moravsky's work, you know he talks about some of these people in the book The Road from Montparnasse. In 1945, Crane and Luno brought Hayek to America, initially on a book tour to promote the Road to Serfdom, but then as a professor at the University of Chicago. In the spring of 45, Luno paid for Hayek to come to the United States on a 5-week book tour, which included an appearance in New York's Town Hall with an estimated audience of 2,000 and also a radio broadcast. On this tour, Hayek had the opportunity to make his own case directly to the American people. But that would soon change as his business admirers began to make the case for him and in their own way. So one of them was through a version of The Road to Serfdom in Reader's Digest. Crane and Luno loved Hayek's message. They thought it was perfect and agreed with it, but they thought the book was too intellectual, too highbrow for American audiences. So they wanted to create a version that would be more accessible to ordinary Americans. And so they arranged for the magazine Reader's Digest to publish a 20-page condensation. So they took the original book, which runs at, 250 or 300 pages, reduce it to a kind of 20-page digest. But they didn't just shorten it, they also made key changes. So Hayek's focus is primarily on communism, but they shifted to focus more on Nazi Germany, which after all was an enemy that every American in 1945 knew well. In the summary, they wrote, fascism and what the Germans correctly call National Socialism are the inevitable results of the increasing growth of state control and state power, of national planning and socialism. So in other words, if the United States government begins to plan the economy, and to some extent that was being done during the New Deal, this would lead us to become Nazis, which was of course exactly who we had just been fighting during World War II. Now, of course, this was a sleight of hand because both German and other communists had been fighting the Nazis. Nazism and Soviet communism might have both been bad, but they were not the same thing. But in the Reader's Digest version of The Road to Serfdom, they became the same thing. And I think I'll just, well, okay, so the key point here is that the World War II fight against European fascism was now transmogrified into a fight against economic planning, against government engagement in the marketplace, and from there into a fight against Social Security, minimum wage laws, and other New Deal reforms and protections. Hayek's nuances and caveats were also expunged. So his discussion, which I quoted earlier, of all the areas of legitimate government action, say about pollution and regulating chemicals, were completely omitted. And crucially, his rejection of laissez-faire. So even though Hayek has explicitly said this is not a brief against laissez-faire, in the hands of his American supporters, it becomes exactly that. And key phrases in the book were rewritten. So here's just one good example. In the original, Hayek writes, there can be no question that adequate security against severe privation and the reduction of the avoidable causes of misdirected effort and consequent disappointment will have to be one of the main goals of policy. But if these endeavors are to be successful and are not to destroy individual freedom, security must be provided outside the market and competition be left to function unobstructed. So in other words, Hayek is acknowledging the reality of market failure and saying that ways have to be found to provide it outside the market, either by government or private charity or something. But in the Reader's Digest version, this somewhat subtle argument is reduced to, quote, if we are not to destroy individual freedom, competition must be left to function unobstructed. Now, Bruce Caldwell notes that Hayek attempted on many occasions to make clear that his desire for, quote, a clear set of principles which enables us to distinguish between the legitimate fields of government activities and the illegitimate fields. You must cease to argue for and against government activity as such. But arguing against government activity as such was exactly what his American backers did. So in other words, they turned his rather nuanced argument into propaganda, anti-government propaganda. And then they pushed it even further. So the Reader's Digest version was cartoon-ish, but it was soon surpassed by an actual cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom that was published in the magazine Look, which was one of America's largest mass circulation magazines at the time, and distributed by the General Motors Corporation. It had only a trifle of text, just like 18 lines of text, captions, and it was called The Road to Serfdom in Cartoons, and it presented the entire argument in 18 pictures and captions. And basically, it begins with World War II planning and argues that the planners then deliberately use that to then install a totalitarian dictatorship. And so here's just two examples. And as I've already mentioned, although Hayek's argument is focused primarily on communism, a planned economy like the Soviet Union, nearly all the images in the cartoon version are actually images of Nazis. So you see the Heil Hitler, the straight arm salute, etc. And the book ends with the final image, which is the ultimate slippery slope argument that in the end, all dissension is eliminated. So today we have Social Security. Tomorrow, dissenters are executed by a firing squad. And you see here, what used to be an error has now become a crime against the state. Thus ends the road to serfdom. Now, how many people saw this? One question that always comes up in any analysis of information, disinformation, propaganda is to try to evaluate its influence. It's difficult to know what anyone thought when they saw this, but we do know something about how many people saw it. The circulation of Look magazine in 1948 was 2 million copies per issue. So this means that potentially millions of Americans would have seen this cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom. And then that leads us then to Milton Friedman. So as I've already said, in 1949, Lunau, Crane, and their allies brought Hayek, his ideas, and Hayek himself to the United States. They brought him to America by arranging for him to be hired as a professor at the University of Chicago. The economics department actually rejected him, but they negotiated with the president of the university for him to come and run a program that they would also fund called the Free Market Project. Now, it's important to point out that he was not hired as the result of an open search. In fact, the economics department had rejected him. The historian Lanny Ebenstein suggests this may have been because, quote, Hayek's views of economic activity and appropriate government policy during the Great Depression were not in accord with the facts. But in 1948, Harold Lunno met personally with the Chicago president, Robert Maynard Hutchins, and promised $15,000 per year for 10 years to pay for Hayek's salary. And so as a result of this, Hayek was in fact hired, not in the economics department, but in the Committee on Social Thought. And the entire time he was at the Chicago, his salary was paid by this business executive, Harold Lunno. And we know that they reached a huge audience. The Road to Serfdom had sold far better than the editors expected. It sold about 17,000 copies, so that was a lot of books. Even today, that would be pretty good. But as I've already said, the Reader's Digest version had a circulation of nearly 9 million. And million more copies were distributed in a pamphlet form. So the goal of the Free Market Project was to stress two main ideas. The first was the primacy of the free market as the most efficient organizer of society, explaining that the free market is systematic, rational, not chaotic or disorderly, and consistently efficient in allocating resources to their best use. So again, here's the economic argument about efficiency. But in addition, to emphasize the relationship between capitalism and freedom, with an emphasis on regulation as a menace to the free market and therefore to freedom generally. This entire project would be financed by Lunno via the Volcker Fund to cover all the academic salaries involved, and also the expenses of an advisory board consisting of persons sympathetic to the purposes of the project. So in other words, not an independent peer review, but people who were on board with this argument, one of whom was Leonard Reed, the head of the Foundation for Economic Education. And the board would meet regularly in Chicago to monitor the progress of the work. One of the specific deliverables was that within 3 years, the participants would agree to produce, quote, a semi-popular book, providing the blueprint for an effective competitive system of free enterprise. And what they originally hoped for was that the book would be the American version of The Road to Serfdom. That is to say, they hoped that Hayek would rewrite The Road to Serfdom for an American audience. Now, in the end, that did not happen. Hayek did not write the American version. In fact, he ended up going back to Europe. But another member of the Free Market Project would. And that was a member who was also supported by the Volcker Fund. And that member was Milton Friedman. And the book was Capitalism and Freedom. Now, I don't mean to imply that the influence of Hayek and Friedman can be attributed entirely to the support of American businessmen. And obviously the episode told here is a small part of a much larger story. But I think it is useful to think about the impacts of business patronage in arguments about economics and government. These champions of competition did not in fact support a free market of ideas. There was no open search for these jobs in the Free Market Project, no competitive process for funding, no call for proposals. Rather, these business leaders handpicked participants and funded the research that supported their political ideology. While NAM and other conservative groups and individuals had long attacked socialism and communism as, quote, foreign theories, and trade unionism as the product of foreign influence, Lunno and Crane literally imported a foreign intellectual, von Hayek, and paid for academics and others to dress up his ideas in American clothes. Now, Eric and I are not saying that these businessmen paid Hayek and Friedman to espouse the views they work. I think that's not how patronage generally works. Patrons rarely tell their proteges what to think or say. Most patrons are not that crude, and few artists or intellectuals want to be pushed around. Rather, it's that patrons seek out groups and individuals with congenial views, and then they strengthen them with moral, logistical, and financial support. So in this way, patronage by exceptionally wealthy individuals or organizations may act as a kind of unnatural selection, ensuring that the ideas that they select come to the forefront of a cultural conversation, regardless of their actual fitness to explain the world. And we argue that it was this process, not survival of the fittest, but selection by the richest, that helped to ensure that these views came to the forefront and prevailed. And it also ensured that neoliberalism, which in the 1940s had various distinct expressions, as historians like Quinn Slobodian and Angus Bergen had argued, it ensured that neoliberalism in America would be expressed primarily as market fundamentalism. Now, today, these ideas are promulgated by a large network of free market think tanks and foundations, all of which are heavily supported by private industry, particularly regulated industries like the fossil fuel industry. And this is just a few examples that we've identified. All of these think tanks promote laissez-faire economics and free market solutions to social and environmental problems. Nearly all of them have denied the scientific evidence of climate change, and recently many have been involved in anti-vaccine and anti-mask mandates for COVID-19. So to conclude, market fundamentalism is not restricted to the United States, but it finds its fullest expression and most wide-ranging support in the United States. This, we argue, is neither coincidence nor historical contingency, but the result of a nearly century-long propaganda campaign to persuade the American people of the efficacy and benevolence of markets and the inefficacy and malevolence of big government, linked to a corollary insistence on the primacy of markets as protectors of freedom. Now, we argue that the free market, of course, is an abstraction. And in fact, we routinely compromise economic freedom when we consider it necessary or desirable to do so. The real question facing us, whether in the United States or elsewhere, is not whether there's a role for governance in the marketplace. The real question is how best to address market failures and remedy when they occur. And this is what links our new work to our previous work in Merchants of Doubt, because we argued that the ideology of the magic of the marketplace stands in the way of addressing many of our biggest problems, from climate change to the opioid crisis, income inequality, to COVID-19. Just recently, Klaus Schwab, the founder and head of the World Economic Forum, not generally known as a radical organization, has stated, quote, "Free market fundamentalism has eroded worker rights and economic security, triggered a deregulatory race to the bottom and ruinous tax competition, and enabled the emergence of massive new global monopolies." We think that's right, but we would add to it that free market fundamentalism has also created the climate crisis. Or more succinctly, in the words of the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.